poor little children will one day live in a nation in which they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was on August 28, 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King spoke those words on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And though we have not truly arrived at the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream, we certainly have come a long way. But I find myself at this conference because in past years, organizations and individuals who claim to be acting in the name of social justice have accelerated trends which threaten the foundational principles on which this justice is founded. Those trends involve the chilling of open dialogue because of perceived offense, the folding of reason to emotional manipulation, and a demand that all follow a strict narrative according to a very selective validation of personal experiences based on immutable characteristics. This should concern us all because it is through open dialogue, reason, and the celebration of the individual through which true social justice is achieved. The 18th century Enlightenment birthed the ideas and values folded under the philosophy of liberalism. These values stem forth from freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience demands the need to persuade through reason. The need to persuade requires open dialogue. Open dialogue necessitates the protections afforded by freedom of speech. And it was through these liberal values that we have seen the greatest advances in human rights in the past 3 centuries. The self-corrective features of liberal principles continue to advance said rights on the idea that we all share a common humanity. It is these values which are now under threat from an illiberal ideology which looks to divide our communities based on rigid dogmas surrounding race. And it is those values now which we bring to a conversation examining the complexities behind racial identity. But it is only through reason, nuance, and compassion that we advance human flourishing for all. Joining in this conversation are 4 speakers. The first will be Mr. Emil Handelsman. Emil is an executive coach who helps leaders and teams rise to complex challenges. Over the past 25 years, he's worked with Fortune 500 companies, venture-backed startups, foundations, and universities. Emil?
It does come off. And it was feeling a lot like the summer of 2021 until I did that. So it's great to be here. One of my hopes from this conversation that we're having is that you all will, to the extent this is an interesting conversation to you, will see how it's relevant to whatever you're working on in your lives, and in particularly to this commitment to liberal values that we all share. And so what I'd like to do is just a few quick things. One is say how I got interested in the whole notion of deracializing people. Second of all, a few quick benefits. And then third, I'll probably wait till later, there's some misconceptions that make it very hard for people to even hear this topic. I wrote about this in an ebook called How to Be an Anti-Race, Anti-Racist, which was a phrase that I heard Greg say 4 years ago. And I look at it as a play on Ibram X. Kendi's book with the addition of anti-race, which changes everything, as I think you'll find. So it was actually 30 years ago, almost exactly, I was in college, and I took a class called Religion and Race. And one day my professor handed us an article that was titled The Fallacy of Race. And he was citing an anthropologist called Ashley Montague, who wrote a book in 1942 that essentially said that according to anthropologists, there are no distinct biological races. There are cultures, there's ancestry, but there are no, this whole notion that there are 4 or 5 distinct races just doesn't have any support from cultural anthropologists. And so I got really interested in that. Again, this is 30 years ago. And 3 months later, I was, remember I was watching the movie Boys in the Hood in my commons room in my dorm. I turned off Boys in the Hood, which takes place in LA, and then I saw live footage of riots in the streets of LA after the Rodney King police officers were let off. And so I went from, boy, we gotta get rid of biological race, to no, actually race really matters. And what I've realized since is that what I was doing was confusing two different ways that the word is used. One way we use the word race is as sort of a grab-all topic for discussions of inequality, discrimination, wealth, right? Doesn't necessarily require a belief in biological race. And the other I call racist classification, which is this classification system that was set up essentially to bolster true. It was an expression of white supremacy. It was used 50 years after slavery was created in the United States to justify it. And I began to look into this, and you see studies of skulls. These guys that would collect these skulls and try and show that. And when you look at this, you really start to realize I don't want to be any part of this. Like they have 5 skulls, and going from one side to the other. There's the center is the most beautiful, and then the Caucasus, and then on the sides there's different ones, and they're the uglier ones. And then evidently that didn't persuade everyone, so they had to switch to intelligence. And now they use the same skulls, but they said these skulls based on this particular measurement, you can look at these instruments, and it's laughable because of course even brain size doesn't correlate to like this tells you how. So you just start to see all this stuff, and you go, man, this is like right at the root of white supremacy. You want to look at the ideology that the Nazis used. They're pulling from all this stuff. And somehow today, a lot of us say, well, race is real, but we think everybody's equal. What we reject is that there's superior and inferior races. We're all equal. But when you get back and look at it, and my colleagues will have a lot more to say about this, you realize, that's not how it works. It actually is a foundation for a lot of, hatred, true white supremacist, true racist hatred. So let me just pivot to saying one benefit to me of undermining biological race is to kind of pull out the carpets from the neo-Nazis and the Klan in our midst, who used to be lucky to field 5 people for a rally. They don't have that trouble anymore. I know that's not what this group is devoted to, but that's one of the things that energizes me. And so I want to say a second thing is that on a very personal level, doing the work that we're doing takes enormous resilience. It takes a lot of perseverance. It takes a lot of energy just to speak up when you feel like the air is thin for conversation. And what I have found the last few years is shifting my own understanding internally around this topic of biological race has given me enormous freedom. And Greg and I actually co-taught a course, a 6-month course. We led 20 people through a process. And one of the things that they looked at was, what if we lived without the notion of biological race? And it was a largely white identified group. And a lot of the people ended up feeling unburdened. Now, if this was a group of extreme anti-racists and you heard white folks getting unburdened, we don't like that. But if you have people who are actually committed to doing something positive in the world and suddenly feel a greater freedom to speak, and it's just very, very personal, it opens up enormous possibilities. And the last thing I just want to say is, actually 2 more quick things. As a parent, I would like my kids and their generation to know that there's a difference between how people see you, right, which is an active interpretation, and who you are. We all know that in this room, but I would love, for me, this is about the next generation. Everyone goes through socialization. Everybody gets socialized. Right now, we're all socialized to believe that there are these races. What if we could have a generation that actually, we're like, I'm not really so sure. There are cultures, there's ancestry. We got to talk about all these issues. We've got to look at these studies of police data. We got to talk about it. But there are no distinct biological races. What would it be like if a generation grew up like that? And because, as Jonathan Haidt said yesterday, this is a complex system. Every system we're working in, K through 12 education, higher education, police reform, there's no simple cause and effect. Like earlier today, the water in the hot water was leaking. So I went over it and I was like, I think I can figure this out. I'm not an expert. Okay, I pivoted, I turned it, and it stopped. That's a simple system. The complex system was someone else had trouble with the toilet and they couldn't fix it. You need a plumber. You can still figure out cause and effect, but you need an expert. Everything we're working with is a complex system. You can't figure out cause and effect. So the question is, what are those safe to fail experiments where you can adjust the parameters of the system, as John Haidt said, to make a difference. And so for me, I'm taking on deracialization as a safe to fail experiment. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sheena Mason. Sheena earned her PhD in English literature from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and promptly joined the faculty at SUNY I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Oneonta, thank you. As an assistant professor in English. Her first book, Theory of Racelessness, A Case for Anti-Racism, presents an alternative philosophy of race and the theory of racelessness, an analytical and teaching framework for understanding race and stopping racism and its effects. Inspired by her theory, she co-founded Theory of Racelessness, an educational firm that helps people use alternative philosophies of race and her theory to truly achieve truly anti-racist outcomes. The Theory of Racelessness helps more people undo racism by undoing the belief in race. Sheena.
Thank you so much. So as I'm listening to Amiel, I'm also thinking about what am I going to say when the spotlight is on me, because I didn't prepare notes, so I'm going to wing it. As they say, I'm going to improvise to borrow from
Much
jazz.
better phrase.
First, before I say anything else, I want to invite each of you to step into your racelessness, to see yourselves not as white, to see yourselves not as Asian or as Black or as some combination thereof or as something else entirely. I want you, as we continue this panel, to really sit in that, to do the radical thing of recognizing yourself outside of the framework that race ideology and racism creates for every single one of us. And I invite you to see yourself outside of this framework, because a lot of what I've heard, and a word that somebody used earlier, a lot of what I've heard from folks is erasure. You feel erased in a lot of ways. And part of that erasure comes from the imposition of race ideology, which we've been talking about consistently, limits and precludes more people from seeing themselves fully and from seeing the humanity that is inherent and inborn to every single human being. And it is the practice of racializing oneself and other people that actually encourages the sort of pernicious divisions that we continue to be experiencing and combating today together, which I'm so grateful for. Something Amiel said was this desire and need to uproot the biological belief, the belief that race is biological, right? With my theory of racistness, it goes further than that. That's part of it, certainly. There are people still who believe that race is biological and that it's meaningful. But even as a social construction, I contend with that imposition as well, because there are three different ways that each of us can look at race. And we can view it as biological, a construction, or as not existing at all, without any disclaimers. And what people who often say they're constructionists, what they often do is say race doesn't exist. And they think that that's saying the same thing as race doesn't exist, right? But what they mean is race doesn't exist in biology, but it exists as a social construction. And I disagree strongly based on my research and my own experiences and observations of the world that we live in. And if we can help more people disbelieve in race as a meaningful category altogether and stop conflating what we think of as race with biology, with skin color, with how we look, with our ancestry, our DNA. Stop conflating it with culture. Stop conflating it with ethnicity or social and economic class. It's a tall order. But if we can help more people stop that conflation, we can help more people see what we share. We can help more people stop believing and presupposing differences amongst themselves and people who don't, quote, look like them, that don't actually always exist, right? And we can start to organize and coalesce around all that we share, the richness of the human experience, as it were. But that takes effort, and it takes filling in some knowledge gaps that a lot of people have. But fortunately, I'm doing it, and I'm not alone. And we can do it. And every single one of us in this room benefits from this. It's not just about freeing so-called white people from their so-called whiteness. It's about freeing every single one of us from the strictures that limits our own human capabilities and potential. Thank you very much.
I think she had notes.
Lower expectations. Flew over them, right.
Speaking next will be Mr. Greg Thomas. Greg is the CEO of the Jazz Leadership Project, a firm that uses the principles and practices of jazz music to enhance leadership success and team excellence in organizations such as JP Morgan Chase, Verizon, TD Bank, and Google. Greg is a professional writer and a senior fellow of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. In October 2021, he co-produced the 2-day broadcast, Combating Racism and Anti-Semitism Together, Shaping an Omni-American Future. Greg.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I do have notes, and I'm going to try my best to do what speakers do sometimes, and look down and look up so they make sure they make contact. But I really wanted to be clear, and I may not be as polished as Sheena is with the theory of racelessness, so I'm going to share from my notes. So based on what we've heard thus far, I think we can all agree, and I'm sure once we hear Camille, that this will also be true, that racialization, which is the process through which we become racialized. There's actually a process through which there's a socialization that occurs where we become raced. And racism are to be avoided, shunned, called into question, even deconstructed. For the sake of analytical completeness, though, another expression I think should be brought to bear: racial worldview. According to cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, a worldview is both two things simultaneously: a model of the world and a model for acting in that world. It turns the individual into an agent who acts, and it turns the world into an arena in which those actions make sense. So that's a good general definition of worldview. Let's add racial to that definition and see what happens. A racial worldview is a racial model of the world and a model for acting in that racial world. It turns the individual into a racial agent who acts, and it turns the world into a racial arena in which those actions make sense. So how pernicious is that? Very. It turns worldview into something pathological. Now I'm going to lean into a description of racial worldview by anthropologist Audrey Smedley, who passed away recently at the age of 90. She's the author of a very important work in this field of inquiry, Race in North America, Origin and Evolution of a Worldview. This is what Audrey Smedley said a racial worldview is. By racial worldview, I simply mean believing and acting in accordance with the social convention that people can and should be regarded as members of one or more of a handful of nebulous, restrictive, contradictory, and conflicting subspecies called races. Okay? So, now the four of us, you'll find we agree on much. But some points of possible distinction has to do with the implication of certain words and terminology that frame individual and group identities and identifications. So I, for instance, as the folks here on this panel know, because you and I engaged on it on Twitter, I describe myself and the ethnic community from which I derive as Black American. I frame this as an ethnic and idiomatic cultural variation within the larger American democratic identity. No doubt, the word black has racial connotations. I'm well aware of that. Now, in the past, we call ourselves colored or American Negroes or Negro Americans or Afro Americans. Then Malcolm X cast aspersion on the word Negro, and a word that was formerly a term of insult or derision within the group, black, replaced Negro. My parents' generation declared that they were black and proud, sporting afros and embracing difference as something positive. I try always to place American with black to qualify the term, bracketing it, in my intention, from race. But as said the noted Jamaican migrant to the UK and Oxford University, Stuart Hall, one of the founders of what became known as cultural studies, by virtue of the work of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, England, there's always a trace left behind from the biological conception of race. You can't avoid it. This is true even of the terms colored, Negro, Afro-American, African-American, because the process of racialization itself placed people racialized as black on the bottom of the social, political, and economic realms in the US. Yet the realm, Yet the realm of culture was the means through which my people could find ways to express freedom of spirit by creating artistic forms in and through which our values and our strivings could be given meaning. That's why W.E.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs. What he called the sorrow songs were and are important. It's why Ralph Ellison declared that the spirituals bespoke our birth as a people and asserted and defined our humanity. And it's why Albert Murray's work on the blues and jazz is so powerfully crucial. Take Murray's definition of the blues idiom. And for those who were here last night, you heard the blues idiom in action. When asked, what is the blues idiom, Murray responded, it's an attitude of affirmation in the face of difficulty, of improvisation in the face of challenge. It means that you acknowledge that life can be a low-down, dirty shame, yet you confront that fact with perseverance, with humor, and above all, with elegance. And since we all, every single one of us, experiences tragedy in our lives, that means that we all experience the blues. So the kind of attitude that derives from the blues idiom is one that had particular origins in a Black American culture, but has reach and application to us all, the particular becoming the universal. So I can accept that there's a trace of race via the word black. A racial worldview has been so prominent in the West since the advent of modernity that even terms that don't refer to skin color may have a racial tinge. In my own work and writing, I'll continue to bracket race and culture to make clear my intention as an idiomatic and ethnic American variation. And finally, I propose Albert Murray's Omni-American concept. His first book was The Omni-Americans, 1970, based on the principle of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, as an idea that embraces the various mixtures that comprise the pluralistic universe that is America. And I also propose omni-humanity as an extension of the Omni-American concept that describes not only our shared humanity, but also our many differences. So now to conclude, because I haven't been able to bring in quote unquote Asian Americans, and I want to do that right quick. I'm going to refer to a historical case in which the word black became an identification in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s, but wasn't related to genetics or shared customs. To fight against continued discrimination they faced in British society, some Afro-Caribbeans and South Asians said they were black as a political stance. So that's the dimension that was actually key in the 1960s and the embrace of blackness. It was a political stand. So my focus is culture more so than politics, because it's through the depth of values and meanings and artifacts of creativity that touch us all where we live, because we share humanity. I don't frankly have much faith in politics to resolve our predicaments, but through cultural intelligence, we can transcend our xenophobia and fear of the other, respect our pluralism, and the classically liberal values that forms the foundation of our American democracy.
Last but certainly not least will be Mr. Camille Foster. Camille is a journalist and media entrepreneur. He's a partner at Freethink, an award-winning content studio whose projects survey the intersection of innovation, culture, and policy. Camille is also a contributor to various national media outlets and co-hosts the celebrated and very respectable media commentary podcast, The Fifth Column.
Hold on for a second. Hold on. And could you repeat it so they could hear?
Very respectful.
Just the end. The podcast being celebrated and very respectful.
Okay. Camille is also a contributor to various national media outlets and co-hosts the celebrated and very respectful media commentary podcast, The Fifth Column. Camille?
Thank you very much.
Just don't speak as fast as you do in the introduction.
No, I won't do that. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here today. It is not often that you have an opportunity to break bread with people who share the values that I think. I will speak much louder. It is a real privilege to be here today and to share the last 2 days with you all. It is very rare that you have an opportunity to break bread with people who have so many abiding kind of points of philosophical agreement, especially in the prevailing cultural ethos that we're all moving in. There are certain things that we believe that have become increasingly unpopular to say, that we've believed all our lives and have always imagined that everyone else just believed as well. And I think for me, that's been very jarring over the course of the last 3 years. But there's a sense in which even before that, because I've always considered myself an individualist, and have always had a very hostile relationship with the notion of kind of racial identity, I've always felt like a bit of an alien, because I will walk into context and introduce myself and begin to talk about things that are important to me, and suddenly discover that I've like ripped the tablecloth off of the table at a dinner party in hopes that all the plates would stay there. Saying something obscene like, I'm not black. I don't identify in that way. But what do you mean? You're obviously black. There's a sense in which, and I love just this constellation of people, but when we talk about the social construct of race, we almost never get around to talking about the ideological commitment that race is. And it's all of the various implications of this idea. And there are also just practical implications. I am a husband and a father of 2 very young kids. My son is 13 weeks. I think he'll be 14 weeks tomorrow. So very, I did all the heavy lifting here. But I also have a 4-year-old daughter. My son, I'm getting to know him. His principal talent is that he can smile occasionally, and he fills diapers. He's privileged. But my daughter, on the other hand, I know her quite a bit better. And she is a really remarkable human. I've often described her as the best and worst person I've ever met. She's boundlessly curious. She's passionate about music. She loves PJ Masks. I've tried to cultivate, and I think it's working, a real deep appreciation for kind of the mystery of our existence and the beautiful things that we kind of overlook on a regular basis, like the sun and the stars and the moon. How does it hang up there? We talk about those things frequently. And we recently relocated to the East Coast. Her first day of school was in towards the end of February, and we get to school. And the things that you think about as a parent when you're enrolling your kid in a new school and handing them over to someone for several hours in hopes that they'll be well taken care of and safe is that you'll see my kid. You will recognize the wonderful things about them that I do. You keep them safe. You'll help them learn. And when we got there, I was not surprised to discover, but was pretty disheartened to see what I'm sure someone put together as like just this wonderful thing. This is celebrating Black History Month. And it was a collage of different books and photos. And there was one book in particular that really stood out to me. And the title of the book was Hey Black Child. And I saw it, didn't say anything initially, walked in, took my daughter back to her classroom. And as soon as I deposited her inside with the teacher, I went and found someone in the school And I pulled them aside and I said to her, I want you to understand that I know my daughter to be a person with individual tastes and interests. And I want you to know that I don't see her as a Black child. She is Leah Lynette Emerson Foster. She has all sorts of goals and dreams, and I want to be sure that you see her in that way. It's my firm belief that if we fail to see one another and ourselves as individuals, we fail to see one another at all. There is a sense in which the really kind of destructive potential of race isn't just racism and bigotry. It is the way that it obscures what is absolutely true, that these categories simply can't contain all of the diversity that actually exists in the world. And to the extent we talk about diversity in the context of race, there is a perverse bastardization of ideas, a real betrayal of values that I know that we all genuinely actually feel. And I think the great thing about a panel like this, and the fact that it even happens in a room like this, is that there are more and more people who are willing to ask questions about this rather obvious, like absurd compromise that we've made, where we allow ourselves to be raced and we race ourselves, where we still embarrassingly abide by the one drop rule, where people imagine themselves as Black or biracial or Asian when they see the actual absurdity of these concepts. And they imagine that somehow the only sophisticated way to talk about complicated problems in the world is to put on racial blinders and try and analyze complicated problems, as was being discussed earlier. It's worthwhile to try and imagine a sort of a genuine racial reckoning, and a reckoning being actually contemplating what is true about the world, what is true about race, and what is untrue about race. But I also think it's important to have a very definitive and well-articulated aspiration. And for me, I'm an individualist. There's no ambiguity about it. I'm not anti-race. I'm not anti-racist. Not even anti-race. I'm not anti-woke. I define myself by my own values. And I think it's vitally important that we have a clear understanding of what our values are so that we can articulate those things. And that when we're having these contests philosophically, that we're having these contests on the basis of who and what we are and what we're trying to achieve. I also love that you opened this entire discussion with that quote from Dr. King, because it is very common for discussions about this stuff in public spaces to revert back to MLK and I Have a Dream. And it is a remarkable speech, and it deserves all of the plaudits that it's received. But it's also worth considering the possibility that we can dream an even better dream than that. And that when Dr. King talks about dreaming of a day when white girls and white boys and Black girls and Black boys can play together, the aspiration is actually bigger than that. There are no white girls and no Black boys. That's
Amen.
not a thing. And it is wonderful and it is liberating to recognize that fundamental truth and to celebrate Dr. King and appreciate his vision and his bravery and his courage in the world he helped create for us, and to still aspire to something even better than that.
Now that all the speakers have spoken, I'd like to invite them to speak among themselves for about 10 minutes. We will entertain a Q&A session afterwards.
Ready, get set. So something that I think everyone has touched on, and Camille brought it home for us, was the fact that the imposition of race, the practice of racializing people, ourselves, and if we do it to others, it actually obscures individualism. It actually makes a sort of monolith, a false monolith of entire groups of people based on the racialization that doesn't match reality, that can never match reality. Something that came out yesterday during one of the panels was that among Asians, there are a multitude of ethnicities, right? There's a multitude of cultures, nationalities, languages even in the same nation, right? But yet, in the context of America, where we like to impose race ideology and we teach it to our children and we uphold it ourselves, often unintentionally, and I would argue often without malice, somehow the rules go out of the window, so that racialized Black people in particular are often viewed as thinking one thing, thinking in unison, when in actuality, the consensus, a consensus has never been reached among racialized Black people, even just in the context of the United States, ever on anything. You know, not everyone who's racialized as Black in this country likes soul food, for example, right? We don't even speak the same variation of English, right? That's largely regional, also economic class based. There are not all racialized Black people, this might be surprising, are poor, okay? Because in this country, the imposition of race actually, it gets conflated with poverty. But if you look at the statistics, it's not the reality. And that's what makes it so pernicious. And we see this imposition of whiteness onto people also functioning in precisely the same way. It obscures differences, it obscures similarities, even amongst the racialized white group. Never mind the white versus Black, which is like how Americans tend to conceive of race, right? And so in that way, we can honor MLK Jr., as Camille so articulately said, and we can dream bigger. And just because something is hard, and mind you, this is gargantuan, right? I spend all day, every day, seemingly, talking about a better future for every single one of us, all of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And that takes work, actually. And we will never reach utopia on this earth, okay? But we can do this thing differently. And we needn't look at the hardness of it as an excuse or a reason to limit our own imaginations. Free yourself from this racialized framework of understanding yourself and the people sitting across the table from you. And if you can do that, your imagination is going to go wild in some of the best possible ways. And the depression among the younger age group of women that Jonathan Haidt was talking about yesterday, a lot of that depression is because of the forced imposition of race ideology. That way of seeing oneself is stifling. It's constricting. It's not rooted in reality of any of us as a complex human beings that we are. And it's making people feel like they don't belong in an entire world based on their racialization, never mind just in the US. That, of course, is going to have mental health and wellness ramifications. But when you open the door to possibility of acknowledging both the history and contemporary realities of racism, hear me when I say that. We acknowledge the history in the now, but we refuse to uphold the whole machinery of it moving forward, because we can do better. And we want more for our kids. I want more for your kids. We want the same things in that way. And we want the individuality of every human being to be at the forefront of every conversation, of every education, curriculum, of all of that.
So just to follow that passionate eloquence, a couple of things. One of the things we've been talking about and riffing on is the notion of common ground. And that's good. I think we have to have common ground of certain values that we hold in common. And not only we're all human values, that's important, but certain foundational liberal values. One of the fundamental values is the value of the individual. We're talking about liberal values here, okay? But as Camille also riffed on, we also need what we call higher ground. So it's common ground, but there's also a higher place that we're going for. And part of getting to that higher ground is confronting, and it's a radical notion, but confronting racialization, racial worldview, and the very concept of race, all of which work as a feedback loop and becomes racism. And if we can do this, and it's not easy, it takes courage, but if we can do this, we can, to use Camille's metaphor, we can actually pull the thing under there and leave what's important still on the table. without disturbing everything. But people think that, oh my God, erasure. You're gonna take away my culture. You're gonna take away my ancestry, my heritage, no.
None of that.
No, it's not true. But it's gonna take a lot of work, and we certainly hope that you will, we agree on so much. So we hope that you'll support us in our efforts to support liberal values in this particular way and through this particular avenue.
Just something I would add to that, it's an effort each time, is there were a bunch of conversations at my tables and in the room about how unfortunate and stupid it is that colleges put all billions of Asian complexities together into one Asian group.
Yeah.
So that's often considered a race. So one of the benefits of this would maybe to disaggregate that into many, many different groups. Not that we necessarily want to set quotas on that either, but at least it would loosen things up a little bit. The other just connection I want to draw, connected to Israel, is that, as some people have said and written, we basically, people who are against Zionism and violently against Israeli policy, let's just say, many of them are exporting the American racial conversation to Israel. So we can either say, number one, that's a square peg in a round hole, it doesn't work, which I think is worth saying. And people are saying that. We can also say the thing that you're trying to export doesn't have much under it. There's no there. So we got a two-pronged strategy that might be helpful for all of us who are attending to the Israel relationship as well.
Yeah, that resonates with me for a lot of reasons, because part of the solution making, which I'm 100% about identifying problems, and I'm 100% about solving those problems. Like, sometimes I just get sick of people pointing out problems and not necessarily having solutions, right? But that's the human story. Part of the solution and part of bringing into fruition the ideas that we're talking about here comes with relativizing capital R race and capital R racism in the context of the United States. Because part of what hinders us in terms of the knowledge gap and the belief systems that most people have that they're brought up into is a sort of unknowing that just because it happens in America one way, or because it has happened one way, doesn't mean that we should take that American-centric framework of analysis and history and apply it to every other situation where we see something bad happening, right? Or for that matter, where we see something good happening. And if you can help people step outside of themselves in a lot of ways in the context of the states, then you can help people have more critical understandings of what race is and what it isn't, what racism is and what it isn't, and how it operates differently across time and across people. Because one common refrain I've heard throughout this conference is the varying stories of persecution and oppression that different people have had. Because nowhere on earth, as far as I'm aware, is a utopia, right? So all of human history have experienced some form of violence and struggle and oppression. And part of how racialization works is the imposition of inferiority or superiority onto groups. It happened with the Jews. I was saying this earlier. It happened with the Jews with Nazi Germany, right? They were racialized as an inferior race of people, and based on that racialization, they were persecuted and murdered and displaced and dispersed. And that acknowledgement of, okay, in that instance, historically speaking, racialization didn't work as black versus white. And this is where the Whoopi Goldbergs of the world misstep, right? It wasn't black versus white, but it was still racism, because that's what racialization does. It makes an excuse for people to persecute other people, other human beings. And if you look at all of the different countries, you will hear and you will see similar instances of that pernicious nature of racialization. That's not the black and white American flavor of racialization that still enacts the harm. And there's nothing, my mentor from Howard University, Jacoby Carter, he's a philosopher of race, he taught me much of what I know about all of this. And he says there's absolutely nothing positive about being racialized. People make the best of it. People coalesce in groups because of it, in response to it. But that's very different from being born into a practice and there's inherent positive benefit to that practice. That's different. We don't have to just settle for the status quo, but it takes somebody to be audacious, bold, fierce, and knowing enough to step outside of the
Okay, the two of you
strictures
have been both promoted yourself really well so far, so congratulations.
and to invite people into the embracement of racistness for every single person's benefit, except the person on the extreme ends of the spectrum who would rather everything stay the way that it is, right? And who benefits from it.
We're coming up on the end of the hour. I'd like to move to the Q&A. Mr. Angelo Eduardo.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I wrote some notes because I don't want to ramble.
You go a little louder?
Yes. So this is touching on what Greg Thomas already started talking about. He's been preempting the argument. But, you know, the larger question is, if not, quote unquote, Black American, then what? Right? And the thing is, my question for Greg, and I would love to hear your insight on, is why even tie the culture that created, or the culture and the regional sort of location that created the blues, right? The Mississippi Delta. Why take that and also take, you know, the Midwest region and culture that created Motown and the New York City region and culture that created hip hop, and tie all of that under this umbrella of Black culture or Black American culture.
Black American.
Right, so Black
There's a
American,
distinction.
right.
Right.
But I wonder what the point of the distinction is, because it seems to me that the intention there is to, in some way, own those disparate cultures and unify them under the aegis of something.
Okay.
But in my view, they're already unified under the aegis of being human. They're created by human beings. And we own them regardless of our ancestry just as much as anybody else.
Okay,
So
I agree. However, we have human similarities, human differences.
Mhm.
We need to acknowledge both. We have the historical reality that opera started in Italy. Does that mean that Italians own opera? No.
Right.
When you create an art form, in which the values and meanings of a particular people in a particular place and time is created, it becomes a gift to the world. So you're right.
Mhm.
But it was created by Black folks, Black Americans.
Ah.
But
there's the racecraft.
No, you interpret it as racecraft. I am clearly defining my terms. Now, you may not accept my terms, but now, as I told Camille on Twitter. As I told Camille on Twitter, I am willing. First of all, as I tried to say in my presentation, it's going to be hard to come up with any term that doesn't have a trace of race.
Right.
But I am ready and willing to give up Black and use Omni-American, because Omni-American embraces the shared Americanness and also the distinctions and the differences among us. That's why when I said omni-humanity, I didn't just say humanity. I said omni-humanity because in my definition that encompasses what we share and our differences. Our differences are important, and our differences are what ultimately becomes the point of tension between us, and we need to embrace both.
Well, let me just take a shot at trying to pull back from the specific prescription about whether or not we're Black or Omni-American or anything else, and just say that we live our lives by abstractions. We depend on them. They're necessary.
Yeah.
And in music, we have genres, and we're comfortable with that. Abstractions are valuable to the extent they're useful and they help us navigate the world. A map is an abstraction. If I gave you a map and it had all of the details of everything in New York City, it would actually be completely useless. You might as well just be in New York City. You couldn't find your way anywhere. There's a sufficient level of abstraction. There's a sufficient kind of abstraction And there are ways in which certain things, like race, could potentially, in almost any context, be sufficiently disruptive and sufficiently obscurant that they're not actually helpful anymore. And I would submit to you that even when I hear you describe Italians creating opera,
Oh, it started in Italy.
this is a region of the world, whatever. Countries, peoples do not create things. They don't even create their cultures. There's no one culture in those places. The lines and the boundaries between these things are amorphous. They bleed into one another. They overlap in all sorts of sloppy ways. There is a sense in which you have to kind of codify and cement these identities and these groups in order to talk about things as Black music or Italian music. And I do think that there is something potentially harmful, not in the same way, but potentially harmful about engaging with that sort of abstraction rather than acknowledging, it's opera culture. And that's fine. I think that can still be very practical and valuable without all of the added baggage.
We're running out of time, so let's take 2 more questions. Betty?
I'm not sure I agree with your view, because the reason why I came to this meeting, this retreat, is primarily because
I twisted her arm.
just so everybody knows, Betty graciously came out here. She's now only 85 years young, okay? And so she's the first Chinese American woman who passed the California bar exam. And she founded the East West Bank, and she's trying to get me to shush off, shush now. I'm not sure that I wasn't sure that I was in the right retreat, but I love the title of the Alliance of the Multi-Diversity, and I want to embrace the multicultural and the multiracial component of this group, because I see that as a way to achieve the goals that many of you agree on. And that is, if we can work together as a group, recognizing our differences in skin color, recognizing our differences in culture, to speak out on common issues, we can affect many in our own racial and cultural communities, that there are other cultural communities that we are in sync with, and that have the same values that we do, and may have the same goals that we have. And this is the first group that I have ever heard of where I could be welcome to be able to be an Asian and be appreciative, except for the one group where I was the president of a minority financial institution on a national basis. And we did a lot of good there in terms of our own individual. Would my beliefs be contrary to what you are saying?
Let's get the answers to the next couple of questions quick fire. We have a few minutes left.
Okay,
world that's based on fallacy. You can embrace your Asianness. And so you talk about map. The map ain't the territory. So underneath the territory, there's all kinds of distinctions. But there was a time when they separated things between Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. That was in the 19th century. The yellow races, the black races, the white races, that race piece is up in there. So that's what we're trying to confront, okay? So I don't think that we totally disagree, but for us, we really looked at this race issue closely, so that's why we want to make those distinctions, okay?
Next question. Let's keep the questions and answers short. Eric?
I'll keep this very short. Should I take the black out of free black thought? Why or why not?
So I was talking yesterday about how the naming of free black thought is really radical, which might make some people cringe, but there could be some positive things about something being radical, right? It's radical because it's recognizing the history of how, because of racialization as black, thought has never been free in some ways, right? And there hasn't been a consensus. And so if we have this platform where a multitude of quote unquote black voices can coalesce and show the complexity and the non-hegemony of it, right? Then that's a powerful thing. But what would it look like if instead of free black thought, it was free thought? And then you did the same thing, but without that racial signifier, because that's how people are going to interpret it inevitably. Without the racial signifier, if you still are focusing on featuring racialized black people primarily, right? What impact could that have in helping more people get outside of the bounds of what that is and recognize, oh, it's just free thought, right? Amongst people who I thought think the same, right? For a lot of reasons. And I'm not married to that suggestion, but as you asked the question, I was like, oh, free thought, that could be something.
We're talking about branding and marketing.
Right. And also that free black thought actually doesn't just feature black thought. Actually.
Right.
It actually is free thought. You featured all kinds of different people. It's
I
not
know,
black,
one of
so
my
kind
friends included.
Okay, and myself, and her also. And we're distinct, but we got similarities. But it's a branding and marketing issue. Roland Fryer has an organization that he's a chair of called Reconstruction. It's geared to young people. And on the site it says they are unapologetically black. Why do they do that? Not because they want to continue racialization.
But they are.
They are. I mean, you could say it's strategic essentialism. That's one of the topics. But you know, I know. You've heard that before. Okay. But I would say, just straight up answers. From a branding perspective, you start this way. If you want to, at some point, after establishing your brand, have a new brand that's free thought, because that happens all the time. The Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, Institute for Liberal Values. You got both still, see? So I would say that it's a branding and marketing issue.
Succinctly, compromises cost you something, and it's worth contemplating what the compromise costs you. If you earnestly believe that blackness is not a thing, and if you do not want to further reify that concept, promulgate it, what does this compromise cost you?
It's a worthy question.
Two more questions, please. Gentleman with the long hair.
One of the points yesterday from Jonathan Haidt was that previously between liberals and conservatives, they were both operating in the framework of liberalism. Liberals within that framework have, really prioritized that individuality. Many of them come to being liberals because they found community values, community systems, some way oppressive to them, didn't work for them, the expectations placed on them didn't work for them. And they emphasize that. Conservatives, similar to liberals, emphasize autonomy, but they want to use their autonomy to join a community, to often practice their culture, their ethnicities, whatever. They're like that they're voluntarily being a part of community. They're motivated by that. Is the sales pitch, not that it's a sales pitch, but does it sound any differently if you're talking to people that you're assuming aren't thinking of themselves in this hyper individualistic way. It sounds like a lot of this is meant to speak to the people who have been unable to be individuals because they have the expectations placed on them, and not so much per se the conservatives who are still operating within the liberal framework, who want to use their autonomy to actually, they like making choices because it draws them closer to a specific group. Because if you have a large section of those folks all choosing ethnicity as like the thing that they're going to build around, it's kind of like you can stop using race, but then you still have this group of people who inherit their
Okay,
Excuse me, we're running short of time, so keep your answers short. But we have
absolutely. We are for individuals who individually and personally made a decision to not racialize ourselves. We might call it different things, but we have said we're not with that anymore. That's our decision. Now we are talking to others. Whoever can vibe with that, whether they're left or right, liberal, conservative, cool. If you don't, try to learn more. But when you talk about the process of cultural change, and you talk about the S-curve, you always have the innovators and the early adopters. We're trying to get early adopters from whatever political stripe. Then you get enough of those early adopters and you keep going, and then at some point you're going to get to the mainstream.
One thing to add, in contrast to groups that focus on individualism, think about climate change. It's probably the greatest collective action challenge in human history. And right now we have incredible gridlock and polarization politically that keeps us from taking action. And a lot of that has to do with the racial origin. So everybody who cares about climate change, and there are a lot of people who believe in science here, so who believe in it, ought to wonder, how do we shift the political polarization dynamics so that we can actually, through free market and government, do something positive about climate change. And perhaps what we've been talking about here is a way in that complex system to shift the parameters.
Last question, the lady back here.
Hi, this question stems from...
Can you stand up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So on college campuses, there's opposition to learning classical Western literature because some view it as being created by white men. So I wonder what your idea would be in a post-racial world, raceless world. Would there still be African literature department? I know in the Asian community, there's been protests long, ever since the 1970s, to establish Asian studies. And the high schoolers are petitioning right now in New Jersey and past, teaching Asian American history. So what are your visions on the ethnic studies departments or literature or faculty position in both college and high school?
I think that ethnic studies is an entirely different thing. Where we fall into traps is when we racialize what ethnic studies is, like what that is. I advocate for the learning of all literatures, right? And I think that, like you said, African studies, I think, okay, yeah, sure. But then when we start talking about Black studies, to me, that's something different. But when I say Black studies, a lot of people are going to hear African studies, or they're going to hear Black American studies, right? So I think that those departments ultimately, Black studies departments, ultimately came out as a result of racism. Those texts weren't being taught in American educational systems. So they said, as a result of that, let's create our own departments, our own fields of studies, where people can come and they can learn from other people, right? And to some extent, that's been successful. But where I see that kind of thinking in terms of future making falling short is if it's being racialized. And it's because Europeans, for example, that literature, or even classics, which isn't exactly European, is because we're racializing, or people are racializing that literature as quote unquote white, which then makes them want to exclude it to some extent, right? Because they say, oh, white men especially, that's the talk. White men have had their time, right? They've had centuries of study and whatever. So now we're gonna replace it with these Black voices or these ethnic voices, as if Europeans aren't ethnic, right? So I think that the solution there has to be a more meaningful and productive conversation about the difference between race and ethnicity, Stop racializing European literature, stop racializing African literature. Let's study all of it, right? Nothing is off the table. And for the programs that exist where they're called Black studies or something, or Asian studies, something like that, is there a way in which those fields of study can be rightfully integrated into whatever corresponding field of study that already exists? For me, I'm an African American literary specialist. I
Excuse
also
me, Sheena, we're running short of time.
Yeah.
We have a
Okay.
we have a
Yeah.
special guest here, the gentleman.
I'll yeah.
Why is
So-
our panel
No,
short?
so,
Only our panel.
would you like to complete your point?
Yes, please,
Okay.
if I could at least do that.
Yeah.
So so recognizing why those fields of study and why that call to action is happening is important, and then thinking of meaningful ways in which certain types of fields of study can be integrated. For me, as an African American specialist, I call for the integration into American, right? And if everything is taught 365 days a year, right, the complexity of America, problem solved. Everyone gets what they want. But so long as we insist on the distinct and separate, there's going to be a problem.
Okay, so, this is taking, I was part of the planning committee, so I'm taking planning prerogative. Thank you. I was on the planning committee, I'm taking prerogative because in the back, we have Mr. Donald Harrison, who is the NEA Jazz Master who performed last night, who some of you checked out. But just keep it brief, bro, okay? Okay.
Can you come up to the front?
Oh, yeah, that'd be
Live
cool.
stream?
To the microphone. Oh, that'd be perfect. Yeah. Because he's going to be on the live stream. Yeah, you got the microphone? Yeah.
Yeah, put him on the mic.
Yeah, no, just go right there. No, the other side.
I just want to make sure. Yeah.
Perfect, yeah.
No, I was just commenting, in jazz music, we've gotten to a place where we call each other human beings. And we just say he's a human being, or she's a human being, because they do the things to help society and each other grow, and we work together. So I'm just listening to everything, and we're still using racial terms, but it seems like there should be a parent organization that has the term human being in it, and then you change the focus of what you're trying to do to being a human being, and that captures everything I think that you guys are talking about, and that comes from us little jazz musicians.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.